Welcome to the Super Gamer Podcast. Welcome to the new Super Gamer Podcast, episode 165. Our guest this week has a PhD in Communication and Media Studies with a focus on video game studies and digital media, is a course instructor, wrote their dissertation on Resident Evil, is a pixel artist, a game designer, and a YouTuber. We have Chris from Makopowered Gaming. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Right off the hop, I think you're from Winnipeg. I'm from Winnipeg.
I am from Winnipeg originally. I was actually, okay, so slightly awkward, but I was actually just there for a few months because a family member is ill, and so I came back to Winnipeg to help take care of them. And honestly, that's also kind of why I haven't put out any videos recently.
Well, sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's been slow going, but like real life trumps putting out videos, so.
Yeah, of course. You also went to the U of M. I went to the U of M.
Really? What did you take there?
I took history, which I have not used for anything.
Yeah, I have a weird agglomeration of undergrad degree focus there, because like my undergrad degree was in film studies, which I have extended to what I do, but I have a double minor, one in English, which, okay, fine, the other in classical studies, which my poor students got to learn about last week when I incorporated Greek theater into their lesson on the sound and acoustics of theatrical performance. So if any one of them is listening, I'm sorry again.
I imagine classical, like, that comes up in game studies surely all the time.
You know what? It actually a surprising amount, especially when you're talking about stuff like God of War or Immortals: Phoenix Rising? I think
yes.
The Ubisoft game that kind of rips off Breath of the Wild. But yeah, like there are a lot of games that either use classical trappings or wind up using like a classical structure. So I'm not sure if you were joking when you said that, but
Not at all,
found it odd. I've just found it weird that I've had to use it, or not had to, but found myself using it as often as I have.
One thing I always like to ask for people who have, lived in one place and then another. I mean, you're still in Canada, but have you noticed a difference in the gaming scene at all from when you were in Winnipeg to when you're in Toronto or the Toronto area?
Sorry, just taking a moment to think about this, because it's a little hard to say because I moved here for my degrees. Like I moved here to get my MA and then wound up staying here to get my PhD, and that eats up a lot of time. So like while I have done a lot of gaming, it's been very much okay, I've put in my 15 hours of whatever, I'm going to play something late at night for like an hour or two, or just not sleep, play something overnight, and then get working again the next day. But I have noticed that, at least in Toronto, there's been a shift lately, like in the last 5 years, where dedicated gaming stores are kind of disappearing. Like I can think of at least 4 off the top of my head that I used to go to that don't exist anymore. Like everyone knows about ANC Games because it was the focus of a few documentaries, and they're still fine. But there are a lot of the smaller game stores that are kind of just disappearing because of the shift to digital. And with those game stores disappearing, the face-to-face interaction and the camaraderie that occurs when you just like randomly meet someone who's interested in the same games you are disappears with that. I've noticed, like when I was in Winnipeg, again, I was largely focused on taking care of my family member, and I had to teach remotely because it was an unexpected thing. But like I've noticed that PNP Games which only had 2 locations last time I was there, has 3 locations now. And there are a few other game stores where it's nice to see that they've cropped up there. So I feel like there's a bit more of an encouragement of competitive gaming here, while there's a bit more of an encouragement of networked gaming there, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, that does. I actually, funny enough, I was worried about PNP games because of the pandemic, and during pandemic, obviously, it was all online, and I thought, well, like so many businesses, I wonder if they'll even come out and think, like, do we need a physical store? Like...
Yeah, and honestly, I'm really glad that they're still around. I did make a point of going there. Admittedly, I didn't get much. I wound up getting an Atari 2600 in an auction, and so because the video connector is so outdated, I went to PNP for one of the Atari to coax connectors. So yeah, I didn't get much, but it was nice to see that the selection was still there, and the prices were still decent. So I'm happy to see that PNP is still doing well, especially in the face of the pandemic.
Totally switching gears here. You mentioned going to Toronto for school.
Yep.
You did get your PhD. You did your dissertation on Resident Evil. It's called Zombies, Phallic Monsters, and Rocket Launchers, an examination of gender representations and simulations in the Resident Evil series. So first thing about that, how much Resident Evil did you have to play to write that?
Oh my. Okay, so keep in mind that like I had to cut off what I was doing at some point. So I started writing after Resident Evil 7 came out, but before the RE2 remake came out, or RE2 make, or whatever you want to call it. So I played through every one of the core numbered entries in the series, along with a bunch of the side games. There are some that I picked up but didn't get a chance to get to until after, which is why I made the video on Resident Evil Survivor with Ashley Versus, and why the next video I'm making is on Resident Evil Gaiden for the Game Boy Color, because these were games I wanted to talk about, but I either didn't have the time or space, or they didn't entirely fit the purview of what I was doing. So yeah, Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, most of Code Veronica. I kind of accidentally soft-locked that because of the shared inventory. Same deal with Resident Evil 0. But yeah, then 4, 5, most of 6. I think I encountered an issue when I was recording gameplay footage for it, which kind of made me stop. But most of 6, and then because 7 was announced while I was doing my initial research, it was the most recent game at the time, and I pre-ordered it, the deluxe edition, which kind of a mistake because it was just a bunch of unlocks, but it's fine. We're all fine here. But wound up sitting down and playing that over a weekend. And I still have a stack of spin-off games that I need to get to, like Operation Raccoon City, Dead Aim, the Outbreak games, which I know that there are fan servers for them, but I'm pretty sure those are run through emulators, and I would be playing them on my backwards compatible PS3. So I'm not sure how that's going to go as a single player game, but we'll see. But yeah, and the Revelations games, I played those as well because of the extensions of the characters from the main series. So I was immersed in that series for a good 6 years.
When there's like a specific part that you're like really focused on for writing, do you need to like save as close to that spot and then just like play it again and again, or were you able to kind of get the notes you needed on one playthrough?
Well, I was recording my gameplay footage as I was playing through, but it was it was also the sort of thing where, for example, with the first 3 games and Code Veronica, you play as multiple characters. And with the first 2 games in particular, since that is a choice you make at the beginning, I wound up playing through them. Okay, the first game I played through 2 times because there's Chris and Jill, but the second game I wound up playing through 4 times because there's the Claire A, Leon B scenario, the Leon A, Claire B scenario. I'm trying to remember what the other 2 were now. It got very complicated very quickly because, especially with 2, with the zapping system, I was trying to track what changed and what didn't in terms of both character dynamics and environmental interactions. So there was a fair amount I had to go through with the gameplay footage. I also live tweeted my replays of the first couple of games. And so I tried to have that data in as many places as possible for me to be able to refer back to when it came to the actual analysis and discussion.
So in the article, the dissertation, you mention a lot of horror franchises. It's like not just Resident Evil. What is it about gender studies in horror specifically that interests you? Well,
okay, one of the major articles that I used and has actually influenced my work is Robin Wood's American Nightmare, horror in the 70s, which deals with a lot of ideas surrounding the repressed. And a lot of horror is very much tied to sexuality, sex, that sort of thing. The whole Eros Thanatos thing, where you get the same physical reactions from being scared as you do from being aroused. And so a lot of the horror genre plays into that by having the fear be of a sexual nature. And because of that, horror movies are allowed to touch on topics that more, how do we want to put this, more mainstream drama would be criticized for. Like a lot of gender fluidity, a lot of LGBTQ plus issues, a lot of ideas surrounding criticism of entrenched hegemonic gender norms is more easily possible in the horror genre because you've got it analogized behind these monsters and behind these scare dynamics. So the idea of being able to take what has been traditionally considered a low genre, for example, with David Cronenberg's first movie, Shivers, or They Came From Within, he had to title it a couple of different things for, I believe, copyright reasons. One of the main Canadian reviews of it was titled, "You Should Know How Awful This Movie Is. After all, you paid for it," because it was funded by the Canadian film tax credit. So this low, quote unquote, low genre is able to tackle ideas that more prestigious genres have only just now started to. And like horror's been tackling stuff like this since the 40s, if not further back. So it's the idea that not only can horror transgress in terms of quote unquote good taste and comfortability, but also in terms of ideas and norms in a way that you would be restricted in doing otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I like you bring up Alien in the dissertation because definitely H.R. Giger's monsters are feminine inspired. I don't know how else to put that. But
okay. Yeah, yeah, okay, if we're going to talk about that, we can't talk about Giger's work without talking about Barbara Creed and her monstrous feminine, because like when she's talking about the alien, and more explicitly going to aliens and the alien queen is overtly female coded, but because of both the inner thrusting mouth and the spike tail, the alien is treated as what Creed calls the phallic mother. So it's the idea that it's a female coded character that is emasculating because it emulates the phallus. There's no subtle way to put this, and a lot of this comes from psychoanalysis, which is very heavily male focused because Freud. Okay, quick side rant. Sorry.
No, please.
Quick side rant. When Freud was looking at the psychoanalytics of sexuality, he took himself and men as the baseline. So the standard for sexuality in his view is male. He even admits in his writings, like in the collected book on sexuality, when he starts talking about female sexuality, he was like, oh, hey, this didn't occur to me. I'm getting to it now. And even then, he only looked at it in contrast to male sexuality as the baseline. And he doesn't even address, and like, he's still looking at everything in terms of a gender binary, even though he kind of recognized a little that the gender binary was a construct. So the thing with scholars like Barbara Creed, Carol Clover, that sort of thing, those sorts of scholars, is that, yes, they're using psychoanalysis, but as Laura Mulvey points out in her like foundational film studies work, visual pleasure and narrative cinema, like this is foundational not for horror studies, but for film studies in general, because it takes on the fundamental nature of viewing and what is being viewed. And Mulvey talks about why she uses psychoanalytic theory, and she says that it is a matter of dissecting patriarchal views using the tools of patriarchy. Because if you can break down something like that using the very ideas that were used to build it up in the first place, there's no way that you can argue against it. It's oh, hey, you're saying what we're saying, but pointing out how we're wrong. So when Clover or Creed or Wood uses psychoanalytic theory in order to point out these issues, it's a matter of using the tools of patriarchy to break down patriarchy. So that's why you get the idea of the phallic mother and why that feels so threatening, because it is emasculating to traditional heteronormative patriarchal values. Yes, it is absolutely terrifying, and this thing is hunting you, and that goes to a core like survival instinct in humanity. But the Giger designs are designed to invoke that sort of gender panic as well.
And then as far as the phallic mother, you bring that up to, going back to Resident Evil, you say Alexia in the series has that.
Yep, because she's very obviously sexualized, especially like when you fight her. Well, each time you fight her, but the first time you fight her, her clothes literally burn off to show her mutated form underneath, and then she becomes this giant pregnant insect mother that swipes at you with a weird combination of a scorpion's tail and a wasp's sting. So you get something very analogous to the stabbing protuberance. I can't say it right now.
Protuberance?
Protuberance. The stabbing appendages that you get with something like Giger's Alien. So yeah, she is very much a phallic mother, particularly in the weird like pregnancy fetish thing where she births mutant insects just before the end of the game.
And on an entirely different note, but also from your dissertation, I had no idea that Devil May Cry actually came from an early Resident Evil 4 build, that they were like, oh, this is too different and not what we want, and then they just made another franchise out of it.
Oh yeah. That build was entirely Hideki Kamiya, which, you know, if you think about that and the games that he's made after, you can totally see how that happened. But yeah, Kamiya was originally building Devil May Cry as well. Kamiya and his team. Let's not give Kamiya sole credit because it takes a lot of people to make a video game. But Kamiya and his team were building Devil May Cry as Resident Evil 4, and Shinji Mikami was just like, okay, this is way too far afield, but I like what you're doing. So, hey, Capcom, can we just like make this its own thing? We'll do what we did with Resident Evil 2. We'll go back to the drawing board and come up with something, but this is too good to just throw out, but it's not Resident Evil. Unfortunately, there is actually debate that that's not the only game from Capcom that spun out of attempts to make Resident Evil 4. Because this hasn't been confirmed, but there is suspicion that Haunting Ground spun out of one of the subsequent attempts, because there's Devil May Cry, there's the Castle in the Sky, and there's the Hookman version. And I believe it's the Castle in the Sky version that people theorize became Haunting Ground. Again, though, that's never been confirmed, but you can see a lot of the DNA there with the castle setting, the dog assistant, and all of that. So the road to Resident Evil 4 is really interesting when you look into it.
Your YouTube channel, Makopowered Gaming, is meant to be scholarly but accessible. Like, what exactly? How does one do that? How do you make games academia accessible?
Okay, so like I'm not the only one doing this, obviously, but the way that I approach it is that while there are a lot of open access journals and access to scholarly works, there's still a certain amount of, how do I put this? There's a certain formatting and a certain language expected of straightforward academic publishing, presentation, all of that. And so what I'm trying to do with my channel is not just incorporate media studies and video game studies theories in order to give wider exposure for people who don't necessarily have access to that, but also do it in a way that kind of sidesteps that language and structure and offers it in a way that is more accessible to people who aren't familiar with wordy academic articles or things like that. I don't know if I'm entirely successful, but a few people seem to like it, so
there is academia has a strange pompousness to its language sometimes. I won't say who because I don't know if they want me saying this, although it is in the public eye. But someone had mentioned that they had referenced themselves in an article, referenced an old article of theirs, and they were kind of teasing themselves about it. And I asked, were you able to speak normally, and say, as I've said before, or did you have to do this sort of as so-and-so said in their article, blah, 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 and they were like the latter.
Yeah. There's a certain wordiness and circularity to some academic writing. Don't get me wrong, video game studies is much more open and accessible, especially with organizations like the Canadian Game Studies Association, which encourages new academics. It encourages people to access the work being done and it encourages alternatives to traditional academic publishing. It's just that with a lot of academic publishing and a lot of scholarly work, there's a certain writing style and a certain structure that you kind of need to adhere to be taken seriously within certain circles. And so, like, I still do that, but with my YouTube channel, I try to take the ideas and boil them down and be able to talk about them back and forth, kind of like what we're doing right now.
You have said, and maybe I'm using too strong a word here, but you've said you dislike Final Fantasy VII, and yet you go by Makopowered. Explain yourself.
Okay. This gets complicated because I actually wrote my MA thesis on Final Fantasy VII. So Final Fantasy VII is the impact of Final Fantasy VII can't be denied, and there are definite ideas in it which I do still appreciate, which is why Makopowered, but also because Mako is legally distinct from Mako, which we have learned is how it is pronounced in Midgar. But there are definite issues with 7 as well, like the idea that there isn't a whole lot of reflection or consideration on the terrorist aspect of the eco-terrorism that Avalanche engages in. Because, yes, they're making a statement, but there isn't a whole lot of consideration for the people being hurt while they're making that statement throughout the entire game. On top of that, there is the almost every female character fawning over Cloud. Do I need to give spoiler warnings for a 30-year-old game at this point?
Well, just in case, let's say spoiler warning and then say what you like.
Okay, so spoiler warning for Final Fantasy VII. When Cloud falls into the live stream and then comes out and is catatonic, the fact that the end of the world is still impending doesn't change Tifa's mind, and she's like, oh no, Cloud, the person I have loved all my life, I will stay with you. And just like completely abandons saving the world so she can take care of catatonic Cloud. She's supposed to be a strong female character, TM, and yet completely caves to catering to the male protagonist.
But isn't that love? Abandoning the world for your love?
I mean, there should be a balance there, because like that love's not going to last very long if the world isn't there to sustain it. Just putting that out there. The thing I find most interesting about Final Fantasy VII, and I don't know how many people think the same way I do, because Hironobu Sakaguchi has talked about how the events of Final Fantasy VII are inspired by him dealing with the death of his mother. And a lot of people take that to mean that's why Aerith dies and isn't revived, and all of the characters are dealing with her death. But at the same time, there is also a more overt dead mother dynamic in the game. And if you think about it, Sakaguchi's kind of aligning himself with the destroyer of worlds, because the literal dead mother in the game is Genova, and Sephiroth's rage and grief is at her passing as well, and him not knowing about his heritage. And so you can kind of see how Sakaguchi could be on either side, and that is something interesting, but it's also something that isn't discussed enough. It's just, oh, Sephiroth is bad, he's gone crazy, which, ableism, but he's going to destroy the world because of his dead mother. And it's like, okay, let's stop and think about that for a second, please.
Well, perhaps an article down the road.
Perhaps. Yeah, I'm really glad my MA thesis isn't published because, like, I wrote it 7 years ago, and I look back at it now, I'm like,
I think most people feel that way about past work.
Yeah.
Till maybe a certain age, then you're like, that's it, I'm here.
Yeah.
Your weekend rental series. First off, when are we doing Micro League Wrestling?
Well, I'm working on that because I actually went out and picked up a C64 Mini, since it is open source and will run Commodore 64 ROMs. I will get to that as soon as I can figure out how to get it running properly, because the issue with a lot of just ROM dump C64 ROMs is the physical DRM. For listeners of a certain age, when you got computer games in the 80s, you would often get like something akin to a color wheel or a slider card, or at a certain point the game would tell you to look at the 20th word on the 5th page of the manual or whatever, and if you did not have this physical media to be able to find the phrase that the game was looking for, you were locked. And so I need to hunt down scans of that stuff in order to get Micro League Wrestling to run properly and make sure that I can review it, because oh my, do I want to. I have found people playing it on YouTube, and I need to play this for myself. It looks so bad and so glorious.
For those unfamiliar, so you bring this up in, you do a video on the Weekend Rental series, which explores, various games of our past. You do a video on the NES WWF game. I can't remember the full name of it.
It's WWF
WrestleMania. And in that video, you mentioned Micro League Wrestling, which is for Commodore 64, and it's sort of like, as you describe it, it's like a turn-based wrestling game where you have words of different moves to select, and then it kind of shows still photos of the match playing out. And honestly, I think that looks super fun.
It is so intriguing, and I know that during the Nintendo Direct there was an announcement for a full-on wrestling art, turn-based wrestling RPG, which I feel kind of picks up the thread of that. But the really fun thing with Micro League Wrestling is that it uses stills from actual 80s WWF matches. Very, very grainy because it's a Commodore 64, and it is not video whatsoever. It's it will flash two different images to suggest the idea of movement. But yeah, it for the time, it is really interesting, and I want to play it so badly, especially with the expansions, because apparently there were a couple of expansions that added characters. In the video, I mentioned that there were only 3 playable characters: Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. But I believe you could also get Jake the Snake Roberts, and there was one more expansion. I want to say it was Mr. Perfect, but I can't remember who it was at the moment. It might have been Ted DiBiase.
Before we get to a couple more articles that you have written, what's your favorite thrift store find? I like your Lego Doctor Who Weeping Angel.
Oh, okay. So I couldn't hold on to it because I was poor and needed rent money. But back in 2015, I went to my local thrift store, and in the glass case was a sealed copy of Action 52. I was like, okay, I'm curious. I'll have a look at it. There's no way I'll be able to afford it. Asked them to take it out of the case. It was priced at $8. And my jaw dropped. I had to get that. It stayed sealed because I wouldn't. I have my limits, and I wouldn't subject myself to actually playing it. But the fact that it wasn't a repro, it was an original copy of Action 52 that I got for $8, and considering it was valued at like $700 at that point, I couldn't say no. So actually, it's a toss-up between that and the original 1978 Dungeons and Dragons core set that I found for $1.99. Like the poly dice were still sealed in the bag. Cool. So
is that when it was still like a pamphlet?
Just after. It was the first edition that came in a box.
Okay.
But like a lot of the artwork in those first books was still the stuff that Gygax and Arneson drew for the pamphlet. So it is I'm drawing this in between my college classes. So yeah, I think those two were my favorite thrift store finds.
I can't seem to find you on Etsy anymore. Are you still doing like pixel art and selling that?
Yes. At I talk good. I haven't done so much pixel art lately for sale. I had to move from Etsy because of a combination of the cost of initial materials with the ever-shifting Etsy rules. So I moved to TeePublic, where like they, rather than having a bunch of stuff ready to ship and possibly not selling it, they print the merchandise as it's ordered, and I get a cut of it, which honestly I'm fine with. I think I can't remember if I put my Resident Evil pixel art onto Etsy or not, but I know that with TeePublic I've got the older stuff that I've done, and I did what's supposed to look like a screenshot of Resident Evil in the style of something like either Castlevania, or in fact I think I use the Castlevania window frames as a template for part of that image. But yeah, it's supposed to give the idea of what Resident Evil would look like as an 8-bit side scroller on the NES. I had plans to do every game in the series, but between the pandemic and teaching and making the videos, a lot of my time got eaten up. The last pixel art work that I've done was about a year ago. I started working on sprites for what an NES port of the 1992 Konami X-Men arcade game would look like, because Konami ported the Ninja Turtles arcade game with very little issue, and so I could absolutely see them porting the X-Men arcade game using the same engine, or using the Turtles in Time engine and porting it to the Super Nintendo. So I started to do like a sprite sheet with the animations for Wolverine, but again, the pandemic, teaching, videos, everything piled up. So I have some of the basic animations, but it's something that I want to come back to at some point.
Moving to your article, Experience, 60 frames per second, virtual embodiment, and the player-avatar relationship in digital games. One thing it made me think about, friend of the show, former guest on the show, Aidan Moher, wrote the book Fight Magic Items, in which Aidan discusses some RPG characters. Some RPG characters were purposely given no dialogue, like Link, for example, doesn't speak. And the idea being, I don't know if this is for Link in particular, but he talks about the idea being that the player doesn't feel disconnected from the character they're playing, right? Because if the character has dialogue, they may say something that the player doesn't feel, and then they don't really put themselves in that. Anyway, that's one thing that I thought about while reading your article there. Where does VR fit when it comes to virtual embodiment? That's
actually a discussion that I've had with people who focus explicitly on VR, because it gets complicated, especially when you're dealing with something like a player with disabilities. Because most VR assumes a certain range of movement, and like you can say the same thing. This is something that I actually wanted to address in a future weekend rental video on the Wii, because the Wii is a notoriously inaccessible gaming system as well, because it assumes a certain range of movement, and people with certain disabilities aren't able to do that. And so while for people who can accommodate that range of movement, that embodiment is definitely there. It's definitely strong, depending on certain other aspects as well. But VR also heavily gatekeeps who can and cannot experience it. In terms of those who can experience it, there's also a certain amount of being in the character's space, but then having the character talk and you hearing it like as though it's coming from you and being like, I didn't say that. Or in a lot of games, you'll see the character's hands as your hands, but they don't have the full range of movement. And so you get this weird, like, okay, I see the individual fingers, but it's acting like I'm wearing oven mitts. And so there is the potential for more embodiment and interaction between the personalities of the player and the character, but at the same time, there's also a new variation on the uncanny valley, if we can go there, where yes, it feels like it's more immersive, but at the same time, because it feels that way, do or can't do, it comes across as heightened, and so it can absolutely break the experience. As well, I'm trying, honestly, that is an article I wrote a few years ago, so I'm trying to remember if I refer to Laurie Taylor's article in there, where she talks about how, because of issues with the Lacanian mirror phase, if you, in VR in particular, because you're supposed to feel like you're embodying that character, when you look in a mirror and see that it is not you, that mirror phase is automatic, like that embodiment and that relationship is automatically broken because of the disconnect between the way that you imagine yourself as looking and knowing that you're looking at a separate character, and that character is essentially looking at you as you're looking at them. It is not the character looking at themselves, and it is not you looking at yourself. You are looking at each other while occupying the same space, which causes a psychological schism, if that makes sense.
That's kind of along the, well, not really same lines, but how does the player-avatar relationship change when it's a game with a set main character, like you mentioned Lara Croft, in the article, as opposed to one, say, like World of Warcraft, where there's a character creation screen, you can make who you look like and who you are?
So, okay. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment to think about this and give you an answer that isn't just rambling. While there is a difference between the two, there is not as much of a difference as one would think, because with Lara Croft, you have a predefined personality, and with that predefined personality come abilities. So she's not just a vehicle that you inhabit to move through the game. Her abilities are defined by her personality and who she was as a character before you came along. While you can't necessarily argue the same thing for a character creator avatar, like with your example, World of Warcraft, the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these character creators do still have predefined parameters. So no matter what you decide to create, the parameters that define what works in game still take a role in defining the characters that you create as well. You're not entirely free to make whoever you want. You're free to make who you want within what the developers tell you you can make.
Right.
So there is still a shaping of the character present that is outside of the player's hands. Honestly, like I know it's an older game at this point, but my mind keeps going back to Saints Row the Third, where they just included every character creation option they could, whether it made sense for the game or not, so that players could make whoever or whatever they wanted in the game. And I can't believe I'm about to say this, but it is honestly interesting that Fortnite gives players this litany of skins and this litany of characters so that you can choose to play as a wide variety, even if it's outside the internal fiction of the game, which I don't even know if they're adhering to that anymore. I think I'll be honest, I don't play Fortnite, but I have done research on it, and the weird, almost like Smash Brothers level of character mashups and cross licensing and all of that is interesting, while still remaining kind of restricted. But there's less of a restriction there than arguably a game with a standard character creator, because those games expect you to maintain a certain atmosphere that the game is going for, maintain certain abilities that the game expects of a character. And so it's still being shaped by the developers as much as it is being shaped by the player. However, once you get into the game and start interacting with other players, that's where the additional outside shaping takes place. It's not so much the game mechanics as it is the ways that you interact with the other players and what the players do with those interactions outside of just, again, going to World of Warcraft, going on quests, raiding for loot, that sort of thing. The RP, the PvP, the ways in which the players take the tools that are given to them and use them in ways that the developers didn't expect and may not have necessarily intended, which opens up these characters more than a character creation system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. It's actually making me think too, like Zelda for Breath of the Wild. I'm still playing, but part of me, I don't get mad, but like you have to kill animals for meat, and I'm always like, I don't want to kill the fox.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I think it was in 2013, reading an article about a Minecraft player who wanted to apply his Muslim ideals to his gameplay in Minecraft. And so part of that was avoiding killing the pigs because of the pork. You don't eat the pork, you don't kill the pigs, and so you try to adhere to that. And so he tried to find alternative food sources as a result. And the way that Nintendo has Breath of the Wild set up, you can do that, but it's more difficult because they expect you to kill these animals for food. It's not as overt as something like the Tomb Raider reboot, where no, you cannot forage for berries. You must kill this deer, otherwise you're not going to get a bow and you're not going to survive. But there is still a certain amount of constraint there.
One last thing that this article got me thinking about, and I tease myself about this all the time. There are several times, Fallout I think is the main example for me, where I go into a playthrough and I'm like, I'm going to be an asshole. I'm going to just do the worst, every option it gives me, I'm going to take the worst one. I'm just going to be a jerk to people. And I can't bring myself to do it. We get to the point where it's like, will you save me? And I'm like, yes, okay.
Yeah, that's interesting because, well, for a few reasons. One, I don't know how many people still use GameFAQs to look up walkthroughs. I still do, but that's also partially because I play a lot of retro games. But like with games with a morality system like that, a lot of the walkthroughs I found are like, okay, so you've chosen the evil route. I'm like, what? No? Why are we just assuming that? But the other thing is as well, a lot of these morality systems are incredibly binary. So there's very little distinction. Or, well, no, that's not what I meant to say. There's very little gradation, rather. You are either capital G good or capital E evil, and there is no wiggle room in between. Like the Mass Effect series literally color codes it in your responses. When I was playing, I can't remember if it was Infamous 1 or Infamous 2, it got to the point where it was like, okay, do you want to save these people who are in danger of falling off of this crumbling building, or do you want to eat this box of puppies? And I was just like, if you're gonna do this, why make it like this? Who considers a box of puppies a delicacy? Give us some range. Admittedly, like, I haven't gotten that far into Witcher 3 because The Witcher 3 is not a game, it is a marriage. But they do a decent job of having shades of gray in their morality system where making a choice may impact something down the road, but it isn't just straight up, okay, you're being the good guy or you're being the bad guy.
Right. And you're looking for more of like a trolley situation.
Yeah. I'm looking for more nuance. There isn't a whole lot of nuance in a lot of morality systems. And even things like BioShock. Everyone talks about BioShock and BioShock Infinite, and the choices are you going to eat this little girl for a little bit more power now, or are you going to save her and get about the same amount of power by the time you're at the end of the game? Or with BioShock Infinite, it's just, hey, so racism, it's bad, right? Do you think it's bad? Except also both sides? Do you think it's bad? So I could stand for a little more nuance. If you're going to throw a morality system in, make it a little more nuanced. That's all I'm asking, because, yeah, in most instances, I'm right there with you. It's like, I don't want to be the bad guy per se. That's like, if I'm going to play a game to be the bad guy, I'm going to play a game where I have the choice at any time, rather than just, oh, hey, you have a binary here, you have a set amount of time to pick, and it will change your destiny forever.
Your article, Eye of the Beholder, it's about Parasite Eve and virtual locations, and something I've never really considered, and it is interesting to consider, is you're talking about how virtual worlds can create real world places, and they're not exact approximations. Typically, like it's Manhattan and Parasite Eve, and it's obviously just like certain buildings of Manhattan to represent it, and the player understands where they are. But what you mentioned in that I thought, oh, that is interesting, is it's not so much what they deem as essential landmarks to put in, but it's interesting to think of what they decide can be left out, like that you don't need to represent Manhattan.
Yeah, it's like when Parasite Eve First off, I love Parasite Eve. I love Parasite Eve so much. Like anytime one of the other YouTubers I talk with mentions Parasite Eve, or in the case of like Sean Johnson's latest video where he looks at every Squaresoft PS1 game and talks about Parasite Eve, I would, like in the comments I was just like, hey, you should do a video dedicated entirely to Parasite Eve. Or when I was talking with Jared from Avalanche Reviews while I was working on my dissertation, because I was using the research he did in his videos to support my own, and we were talking about how underrated Parasite Eve is, and he's like, if I'm president, everyone gets a dinner on their table and a copy of Parasite Eve. And I was like, I would vote for that. But yeah, because of, like, Parasite Eve is an overt example because they had to deal with space limitations and the limitations of the PS1. You're not getting a full open world, and so you get to see exactly which areas of the city they deem as essential for an idea of Manhattan and which ones they reduce. Like, they consider Chinatown important to include, but they consider only like half a block of Chinatown important to include, and that's mostly as an entrance to the sewers. So what is included and what isn't included does, whether intentionally or inadvertently, it does carry a political angle to it, which, like, I've gone on record with this on Twitter and in my teaching and everything, but there is no media that is not political. There is nothing that is just entertainment. If you feel that a piece of media is apolitical, that just means you agree with the politics on offer enough so that it feels naturalized. And so looking at what is included and what isn't included suggests what the developers feel is essential versus what can be excluded, and it's a matter of considering why that is.
Before we go, people can find you at on youtube.com at Makopowered Gaming. Anywhere else they can check you out?
Yep. On Twitter, I am at games_student. I made my Twitter during my MA.
You're going to have to be Games Doctor now.
So yeah, on Twitter at games_student, and on Instagram at Makopowered. Although I haven't been posting much to Instagram lately, again, because of everything that's been going on with my personal life and that. But I will get back to it, I promise. So yeah, Twitter, Instagram, definitely YouTube. Please come check me out.
Chris from Makopowered Gaming, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.